Okay, our next panel will just be myself and Susan Dudley, and we're going to talk about some solutions. I'll just further introduce myself and say I am retired from the Food and Drug Administration, and as I said earlier, I'm now Director for Policy Research at the Mercatus Center. But my real honor is to introduce the Honorable Susan Dudley, who's a research professor at the George Washington Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration, where she has founded the GW Regulatory Studies Program. She's also a former administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at OMB, and I'm really proud to point out she's a distinguished alumni of the Mercatus Center. She is widely published on regulatory matters. So I'm going to go first, so I save the best for last, which is Susan. So let me start. At the Mercatus Center, our approach to regulation is to examine the incentives that are created by our regulatory institutions. As we've heard from Bruce, regulation is now a big business, thoroughly integrated into every aspect of our economic and social life. And firms, if they're to survive, have to invest a great deal, not just in complying with regulations, but in fact in trying to affect the outcome of regulations. And there are many other powerful organizations constantly advocating on one side of these issues or another. But for agencies, whether their goal of their regulatory decisions is to punish or reward businesses or to promote their social welfare or their own bureaucratic welfare, the incentives always produce the same result: more expensive and expansive regulations. So as I mentioned earlier, there are two institutions that should provide some check on those incentives, and those are regulatory impact analysis and stakeholder input. The problem is they both have the same issue. When regulatory impact analysis or stakeholder input run counter to what program managers want to do, they're both frequently ignored. The ability to ignore this input is an excellent reason why we need more oversight of agency decision-making. Counter to the idea of more oversight of regulatory decision-making, however, is the idea that agencies are the repository of scientific expertise, and they should be granted deference by Congress and the courts and by OMB. But the problem with science is it can tell us what the state of the world is, it can't tell us what to do about it. So, for example, science can tell us that we have some sort of a contaminant in water. That doesn't tell us what to do about it. It just says we have a contaminant. But whether we should reduce that contaminant and by how much is a complex decision of law, science, economics, and, I want to add, stakeholder input. And even if it were the case that agencies were the sole source of relevant science, that still doesn't justify leaving agencies unchecked power to make decisions, because those decisions often have enormous economic consequences. If they're not properly considering the benefits and costs of their regulations that come from either stakeholders or more formally regulatory impact analysis, we won't produce regulations that are targeted, effective at solving problems without creating large economic disruptions. So let me start and talk about regulatory analysis, because I have actually a great deal of experience in that. Regulatory analysis, all regulations, like every decision we make in life, have both benefits and costs. But in order to know whether or not our decisions are increasing social welfare, you have to know what the benefits and costs of those decisions are. As Jerry pointed out, the quality of our economic analysis is just not good enough to know that. But even if where the quality is high, as we've also found out, agencies seem to have little incentive to use the results of economic analysis. So one of the questions I want to address is, why is that? Why is there such a small incentive to use economic analysis? And one reason is that in regulatory agencies, decisions are often made early in the process based on fairly narrow criteria. Agencies will tend to choose the most stringent option, generally covering the broadest possible industrial base, without taking into account, for example, whether there's an actual problem to solve, whether there are unintended consequences, or whether their costs so high that solving just a small part of the problem is not worth it. We don't see this in private firms. In private firms, there's incentive to control costs and to target specific markets. You get instantaneous feedback, profits. That incentive doesn't exist in regulatory agencies. There is no feedback mechanism for lack of effectiveness, excessive costs, or covering sectors that don't have a problem. And without that feedback, there's not sufficient incentives to use regulatory impact analysis that analyze these problems. If the decision's already been made and a regulatory impact analysis comes after that, and it seems to suggest that there's a solution different than the decision, well, regulatory decision makers look at that as just muddying the water, and particularly if they think it's going to produce a problem for them down the road. So just as private firms produce goods, regulatory agencies produce regulations, and any input that threatens to reduce the number or reach of those regulations are quickly set aside. So in the regulatory agency, once the decisions are made, all the others in the agencies are expected to fall in line. And so let me give you an example. Many years ago, when I was a supervisory economist, I was told on a Friday, don't come back to work on Monday unless you order this regulatory economist to reduce the cost estimates of a rule that was governing seafood production. The decision had already been made. The decision was made really right at the outset of the problem about how we were going to regulate. And in fact, the economic analysis showed that only a very narrow rule would generate any benefits even. But that, as we economists say, is an anecdote. It's not data. So I wanted to know whether what I had experienced in that particular instance and many other instances throughout my career was common to economists working in the health and safety arenas. So at the end of my career, I began to interview all the senior economists in the health, safety, environmental, and security agencies. And the answer I found out was that kind of behavior is widespread. So let me give you some of my findings. It is common for agencies to make their decisions well prior to economic analysis being completed. And because of this, and this goes to the quality of economic analysis, program managers put a lot of pressure on economists to come up with the right answer. That's the one that justifies their premature decisions. And that pressure works, because often the agency economists are working directly under the program manager who's making the decisions. That, incidentally, is something that the executive branch could remedy fairly quickly, just an organizational fix. Take the economists out of the program areas. In fact, even when what you find is even when the economics is relatively good, those program managers are either indifferent to the findings of the impact analysis or in some cases even hostile, particularly if they think it's going to create a problem for them when they go through OIRA. And again, I'm only talking about executive branch agencies here. OIRA sometimes helps, but their staff is small, and ultimately they have limited authority to return rules. In some cases, they're told to back off politically favored rules. So my conclusion is that the incentive to get the analyses right and to use it is weak, is currently weak with our existing institutions. It matters some, but not that much, who is in the White House and who is in OIRA. That means that others beyond the executive branch have to play a role in setting the requirements to do and use economic analysis. And those parties, including Congress, the courts, and the American public, have a right to see, one, what's the nature of the problem that they're trying to solve? Not what the law says, but what's the actual problem the agency is trying to solve. It should be large enough to be a federal problem, and it should be a systemic problem, not just an anecdote. Further, they ought to project into the future whether or not the market's going to solve the problem if we don't have any regulation. They have a right to see an analysis of all the possible ways to solve the problem, including doing nothing. And what are the costs and benefits of all those different ways of solving the problem, like different levels of stringency. They ought to know what the agency knows and what they don't know, and whether they've made assumptions that if those assumptions were reversed, would it reverse their conclusions? And finally, they ought to know who will be impacted, who wants the regulation, who doesn't want the regulation. That can explain a lot about why people lobby for regulations. So a good regulatory impact analysis can not only help discover how to get the biggest bang for the buck, you've all heard that, but it can also uncover the winners and losers, who are likely and expose the manipulation that we get that produces regulations that benefit the many, benefit the few at the expense of the many. So, what will help this situation? You've heard it mentioned already this morning. I think making regulatory impact analysis a statutory requirement and require that the analysis be published at least 6 months before the proposal is made. So how did I come to that? Well, during the course of my interviews, one agency stood out, and that was the Consumer Product Safety Commission. At the time, there was a requirement in the Consumer Product Safety Commission that the agency consider benefits and costs, a statutory requirement as part of their organic statute. So I interviewed one of the senior economists there and basically was told when they go to make decisions that the decision makers use the impact analysis, they expect it to be well done. And in fact, even the attorneys were arguing that they ought to use the results of the economic analysis because they were concerned about whether or not, if they didn't, their decisions would be legally vulnerable. This suggests to me that there's an enormous difference between having a statutory requirement that requires regulatory impact analysis and an executive order, because the executive order is only internally supervised by the executive branch. Again, I'd like to see the RIAs mandated by law, and particularly I'd like to see it published 6 months before the agency proposal, and that would leave less room for program managers to manipulate the analysis. And further, as Jerry mentioned, I'd like to see program managers transparently explain how they considered the analysis in their proposal. So not a requirement that you have to make your decision according to benefits and costs, but just explain how you've used it. So let me move on to stakeholder input. Because contrary stakeholder input is too easily dismissed, I think we need to go back to formal rulemaking for economically significant rules. Federal agencies are contained in their own little microcosm, and they have their own sort of information sources. But in fact, there's a great deal of information out in the public that federal agencies need not just be aware of, but they need to take into account when they make their decisions. But particularly when you find stakeholder input that comes in the form of comments or coming in to meet with the agency, and those comments and those ideas don't agree with the premature decisions I was talking about, virtually always you'll find the regulatory agency will regard that as just simply a low hurdle to jump over. The incentives to take into those stakeholder opinions into account are at best weak. And unfortunately, those weak incentives exist in our least democratic institutions, which is to say regulatory agencies. So most regulatory agencies today use what's known as informal rulemaking, also known as notice and comment. Federal laws, as Ron Cass has suggested, gave us notice and comment. They made federal documents and meetings available to all stakeholders. However, that access and that transparency does not equate to having an equal ability to influence rules. In informal rulemaking, agencies are required to respond to comments to proposals, but too often they will dismiss the arguments made if they don't agree with them both swiftly and easily. This means that despite the Administrative Procedures Act, it's still too easy for agencies to side with their politically connected allies and ignore those who disagree with them. So again, I want to go back to the previous example I gave in this seafood processing rule. The vast majority of the comments did not agree with the FDA's approach in that rule. So it was summarized in the final rule saying, well, some people agree and some people disagree. So it seems like we're in the right place, right? A common dismissal that rule writers will use will be, the commenter did not provide sufficient evidence to alter the agency's conclusion. Well, if you imagine for a minute, that's a pretty easy dismissal. What's sufficient evidence? You could have written a treatise on it, and they could still make the same claim. But often the agencies just say, agency disagrees with the commenter. So, having leapt that low hurdle, the agency proceeds with the decision they made early on in the process. In fact, formal rulemaking is open to agencies now. It always has been, but it's rarely chosen. Formal rulemaking, as opposed to informal rulemaking, involves an opportunity for interested persons to testify and cross-examine witnesses before an administrative law judge. And it also uses, instead of arbitrary and capricious standard, it uses a substantial evidence standard. And that requires a sufficient amount of evidence to be on the record so that a reasonable person could reach the same conclusion as the agency. Formal rulemaking has generally not been used because agencies say this is more expensive than informal rulemaking. In point of fact, however, if we look at some of the recent challenges to agency rules that have gone on in the courts, it may be that formal rulemaking may not turn out to be more expensive. So maybe the best kind of rulemaking we can have, particularly for the economically significant ones, is a hybrid kind of a rule. And that would combine the informal notice and comment. It would include regulatory impact analysis. But for the really big rules, we would have formal hearings where agencies have to openly and transparently respond to challenges. So there are just to sum up, there are two institutions that I believe are in need of repair. The first is regulatory impact analysis. Again, we have problems with the quality and we have problems with the use, as Jerry says. I do think it will make a huge difference if that becomes a statutory requirement that's then enforced by others outside of the executive branch. And we have the problem of stakeholder comments. And I think by requiring agencies to openly and transparently have to respond, particularly to those comments that run contrary to what it is they want to do, that'll make a huge difference in our regulatory institutions. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn it over to Susan Dudley. And after Susan speaks, we will take some questions. So, Susan.
Well, this is a great time to be a regulatory geek. I'm really pleased that Mercatus invited me here and that there's so many of you here, including we have the chairman of the Administrative Conference of the United States sitting here. Paul Verkeil is here. So among lots of dignitaries, but I'm excited because regulation rarely reaches the attention of politicians or voters because it doesn't reach the attention of politicians because it doesn't reach the attention of voters. There may be specific regulation that someone's concerned about an aspect of it, but regulation as a policy tool really does not. There have been some brief exceptions, and I'm optimistic that we might be in one of those right now. So if you'll indulge me, it's hard being the last person because Bruce Yandel very eloquently raised some of the things I was going to say, as have others. But I'm going to do a little bit of a history, just look at some of the key transitions. Both Bruce and Ron Cass did this a little bit. And I'll start back in the 1930s, where, as Ron mentioned, there was concerns over the growing fourth branch of government and excessive delegation of legislative power to administrative agencies that led to the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946. And it really reflected a compromise between a respect for the separation of powers that's inherent in our Constitution, but also a perceived need for bureaucratic expertise to write and enforce, or to write administrative laws. And as Ron alluded to, that really did allow for the emergence of the regulatory state as we know it today. And I actually testified before the House Judiciary Committee this week. They had a hearing on the Administrative Procedure Act, which turned 65 in June, and whether it's time for amendments. And it made me start to think about it, and I've always thought of it as, certainly it is one of the most important pieces of legislation that we have. But also when I compare our system of regulation to other countries, where they focus on stakeholders. So they'll go out, if they decide to write a regulation, they'll speak to the stakeholders, but they don't open up that regulation for broad public notice and comment. And we do, and that I think is a real strength of the APA. But I think, in part, just preparing for this testimony, I also started to think, well, what would have happened if, back in the 30s and 40s, if they'd taken a totally different approach to the delegation of legislative authority? And I don't know. I don't know what the outcome would be. But they didn't, so here we are. I think another big transition was one that Bruce Yandel mentioned, and that was in the 1970s, where we saw a real shift in how we regulate. On the one hand, we saw the decline in the traditional economic regulation that had been the regulation that they were concerned about when the APA was passed, and that's rates, entry, and exit. And we saw scholarship, actually, so it was people like you, so it was academics and policy entrepreneurs that made people aware that those regulations actually benefited the regulated industry and harmed the consumers. So rather than being a cure for natural monopolies, they were really creating some rather unnatural monopolies. And so we saw bipartisan efforts for deregulation, and we saw, so airline deregulation, trucking, we saw the elimination of agencies, including the Civil Aeronautics Board and the ICC, which you mentioned as the first regulatory agency in your opening remarks today. So that was a remarkable period and has brought real social benefits, not only through lower costs, but also through greater innovation. But at the same time, during that very same period, we saw a growth in what we call the social regulations, aimed at addressing environmental safety and health concerns. So we saw new agencies, EPA, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, OSHA, and with it, we saw different kinds of concerns. Scholars and academics, I guess I was talking too soft, because now it feels loud to me, does it to everybody else? Scholars and administrations were no longer talking about pure deregulation, the way there was wide agreement on deregulation with that traditional form of regulation, but rather were concerned about the burdens and an understanding of the benefits and the costs. So President Carter, actually building on requirements of Presidents Nixon and Ford before him, began to require regulatory analysis of the kind that Richard was just talking about. And focusing on how do we address the concerns but keep the costs down. And in fact, bearing on Senator Warner's comments about the regulatory pay-go, in the 1980 Economic Report of the President, there's a long discussion about whether a regulatory budget should be put in place to constrain the costs of these new regulations, sort of akin to the fiscal budget. At the time, we saw some legislation. We saw the Paperwork Reduction Act, which was not one of the ones that Ron mentioned when he rattled off that list of statutes that we've tried. And that one was focused on record keeping, on the administrative burdens, and it did use a budget-like approach. And it also created the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. We saw the Regulatory Flexibility Act, which focused on the effects on small businesses. But the real effort was coming from the executive branch. So when President Reagan took office in 1981, he used that newly formed Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs to not only track the paperwork burdens, but to provide the central oversight of all regulatory effects. So he continued to pare back on the economic regulations, but he also continued the approach to analyze new regulations. Since then, we've seen some legislative efforts, including some of the ones that Ron mentioned, the unfunded mandate, Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act, the Congressional Review Act. But I think it's fair to say that the bulk of the efforts at regulatory analysis and oversight have come from the executive branch. Through executive orders, through regulatory impact analysis requirements, and through OIRA's central oversight role and coordinating role. And in fact, as several people have mentioned, President Obama just last month issued an executive order that continued to reinforce and build on these requirements to make sure that we understand the effects of the regulations and try to know whether we're producing benefits that exceed the costs. Despite all those efforts, as people have mentioned, regulation has continued to grow. And with it, I think, concerns that we're reaching a point of diminishing returns. And why is that? I think we've heard a lot about that. Again, I'm coming last, so I'm telling you things everybody else has already told you. The pressure to regulate is enormous, and I think Dr. Yandel is going to talk to us a little bit more about that over lunch. Is that right, Bruce, or should I drone on about it? I will leave that for you. So in part, it's because for both legislators and executive branch policymakers, action always appears better than inaction. So it's always better to do something. There's no glory at all in saying, you know what, that problem can be addressed by some other source. Also, as people have mentioned, special interest support regulation, it confers a competitive advantage. And so, and I think Bruce will talk more about this, when you have that combination of special interest supporting and noble goals supporting, it's just very, very hard to resist more policymaking through regulation. I liked Senator Warner's remarks about the incentives when he said, it's great for a politician to go to a ribbon-cutting ceremony, but they don't go when they close the doors. You know, it's that same thing. The pressure is all one way. So we see new legislation, new regulation, all with noble goals. But the requirements to understand what the real effects of those will be, the costs, the benefits, the unintended consequences, they tend to take a back seat. And I should just mention, because people, in addition to new legislation, we also are interpreting statutes that were written decades ago. And so we're writing regulations under statutes that certainly no current congressman voted for and intended for it to be used that way, but probably not even, certainly not the ones who actually initially passed it. So we need to think, I think the incentives really are all pushing us in one direction. So given all this, why am I optimistic? I'm optimistic because regulation is getting attention. It's in the media, it's represented by all of you here. The executive branch has shown an interest, a refocus on regulation, and the Hill. And I think I was really impressed with both of the speakers that Mercatus brought this morning, and their ideas. Richard had actually asked me to talk about reforms, and I'm going to start. I'm fine. I'm going to start talking about reforms, and I think of them in three categories: procedural, decision criteria, and reforms to address individual statutes. So in the procedures. The REINS Act is something that I think at least Senator Warner mentioned, if others haven't. That's, Congressman Owie, legislators need fun acronyms. That's the regulations from the executive in need of scrutiny. And that would require Congress to vote on every major, or the largest regulations before they can go into effect. So it would take the Congressional Review Act and just flip the default, so that a new major regulation doesn't go into effect without Congress approving it. I, like Richard, I like to think through what are the different incentives and what are the unintended consequences that might come about from this. And I think on the plus side, the REINS Act really will bring about some needed accountability, not only in the legislative branch, but I think elsewhere too. We talk about passing legislation with lofty goals, but then leaving to executive agencies to figure out how to do it. And if you do that, then if anything goes wrong, well, it's the implementation that's the reason it's not right. It wasn't my legislation because I voted for something that had these noble goals. So I think it would change those incentives and make our elected officials more accountable. On the downside, I think the regulatory system is probably more transparent than the legislative process, and so I think you see a reduction in transparency and maybe some incentives that we wouldn't like. And if we want during Q&A, I'm happy to share more thoughts on that. The other one is Senator Warner's legislation that he's working on, a regulatory pay-go. I think the incentives, I really like the idea of the incentives that would produce, forcing us all to think about trade-offs. The analytical difficulties of that are non-trivial. It shares similarities with the regulatory budget, and I think people agree that will be difficult. It will be difficult, but nevertheless, I'm optimistic because I think it would impose some needed discipline and generate a real constructive debate on what the real effects of regulations are, and not only the new ones that we're writing now, but the existing ones. What effect have they really had? So I'm very intrigued by that. Congress is considering changes to the Administrative Procedure Act, and several of these have been mentioned. Jerry Ellig mentioned he thought it would be valuable to have a pre-rule comment period so that you could comment on the supporting analysis. And Rick Belzer pointed out that maybe that's in the new executive order, so maybe we should begin to look for that. I think that's important. Improving how public comment is received and evaluated, I think, could improve rulemaking. Expanding formal rulemaking, Richard has talked about that. And I think you used the phrase cross-examination, but that one of the advantages that people argue about formal rulemaking is for the regulations that are driven by data, that there may be other data and that may be contentious, having a formal rulemaking process where you can do that cross-examination could be valuable. Different ways to extend judicial review. Now, informal rulemaking has an arbitrary and capricious evidence standard. Perhaps a substantial evidence standard might be more demanding. People have long talked about the Information Quality Act and whether that ought to be judicially reviewable. And I know small businesses are very concerned that under SBREFA things, the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act, while the analysis and the agency's decision is judicially reviewable, they don't have to consider indirect effects, which often are the big impact on small businesses. And another one that I feel very strongly about, and I'm going to look at Curtis because he will say, only if you give us enough support, is a Congressional Office of Regulatory Analysis. Now, I think OIRA is one of the most important and outstanding organizations. The staff are wonderful. Their mission is to look broadly, have a cross-cutting view, and look at regulations, which counters the tunnel vision that you'll find in individual agencies. But they are constrained. It is not an independent agency. It's part of the Executive Office of the President, which brings advantages because it does give them a little more clout than otherwise. But it also means that they're constrained and that they should not be viewed as an independent agency. So I think Congress needs its own Office of Regulatory Analysis, particularly if it implements some of these other procedural or decision changes. Decision criteria. And others, Richard mentioned this too. I certainly think Congress could build on the requirements that every president since Nixon has had. And one simplest way would be simply to codify President Clinton's Executive Order 12866 or President Obama's more recent executive order, which refers to it. Or they might want to tweak it. Somebody mentioned employment effects. They might want to tweak it to emphasize things that people think maybe are important. One possibility would be to amend the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act or the Regulatory Flexibility Act to incorporate those criteria and expand the coverage. This was something at the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Courts and a lot of things in administrative procedure. One of the things that all the witnesses agreed on, actually there were several things that all witnesses agreed on, but this was one, this codification of the executive order requirements. And I think the advantage is not to be sure that every future president will continue to use them, because presidents will. The real advantage is twofold. One is to bring independent agencies under that review and required to do that analysis, and the other is judicial review. So I think those would be the two advantages of doing that. A big question that Congress will have to deal with is whether it should supersede existing statutes or be subordinate to statutes like Section 109 of the Clean Air Act, which prohibits the consideration of all the things that the executive order tells you should consider. And then my final category is targeted reform. Representative Jordan talked about using oversight authority. Committees are also talking about using budget authority to focus on particular regulatory issues that they'd like to influence. I think Congress should also consider going back to some of the statutes that are problematic, that result in the regulations that really don't, that are ensuring that we're reaching diminishing returns because they're precluding us from considering certain factors. And I would put Clean Air Act Section 109 in that category. Because I think that really is where we get into problems, because we're diverting scarce resources into areas that are not health threats at the expense of things that maybe really are problems for health, environment, and safety. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Susan. I just want to say, before we get to questions, one of the great things about these conferences is I get new ideas. So Senator Warner laid down the challenge. He's right. We slipped behind the United Kingdom from 4th to 5th. And this is the same United Kingdom that somebody wrote a famous book called How to Label a Goat because of their massive number of regulations. So we've heard a lot today about how our regulations are now thoroughly integrated into our economic life. In fact, government has become endogenous to business decisions. We've heard about poor analysis and poor use of analysis, and we've heard how we started 65 years ago with the Administrative Procedures Act, and we've just passed law upon law upon law trying to fix this. So what I learned today is we have two options. We can go back, we can revisit the Administrative Procedures Act and some of our other laws. We can try to fix them and make ourselves competitive. But there's another option. Many of you may not know that the Mercatus Center sponsors a number of graduate students each year, master's students and PhD students. And one of our first graduates from our master's program is here. He's from the United Kingdom, and he said, well, you do have another option. You can rejoin the empire. Thank you for that, Mark. So with that, let me take your questions. And please identify who you are.
I'm Stephan Osborne from the International Trade Administration. When you mentioned the idea of a Congressional Office of Regulatory Analysis, there is the International Trade Commission, where they are charged with thinking about competitiveness issues in addition to trade issues. And I was thinking maybe instead of having to create an entirely new congressional reg analysis office, why not just expand the mandate of the ITC a little bit to include regs? What do you think of that?
Actually, Professor Yandel, do I have to do anything to turn this on? Professor Yandel mentioned that he thought we should do a competitiveness impact, which I found fascinating. I think that's interesting. I know the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice I was at OMB once on the career staff and then again years later. And when I was first there, the Department of Justice did get involved in regulations looking at the competitive impact, as well as the FTC. Not so much now. So I have to say I haven't heard people talk about using the International Trade Commission or Administration, but the FTC and the Justice Department do sometimes get involved. And yet, I mean, they still are. I mean, they are, I guess, really a fourth branch, but there is still some hesitation, I know, on their part about commenting on another agency's regulations and critiquing another agency's regulations. They're much more comfortable, and Jerry Elliott could maybe speak to this in the broader, at lunch when we all come back up to talk. They're much more comfortable critiquing state regulations than they are other federal regulations.
My understanding is that organization, in fact, getting a little feedback here, in fact, does comment on regulations, and they put on their website the comments that they make about the international competitiveness effects of regulations, but all of those comments are internal to the government. And I think that may be the only way it can work, because as Susan says, they probably don't want to openly, somebody within the administration commenting on another agency within the administration. But it would be nice to have more of those things available, certainly to the public, I think. Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff Lubbers from the Law School at American University. I want to thank you for a very stimulating program, and I especially think the study on regulatory impact analysis is very valuable. I'm looking forward to reading that. One aspect of that I was wondering about was whether sort of the cost-benefit analysis of cost-benefit analysis. How much does it cost to do these analyses? And that brings me to a point that I think hasn't been talked about very much today, which is the resources that agencies have, the resources and staffing that regulatory agencies have. And my understanding is that if you look at those, they are below the level of, for many agencies, below the level that they were 30, 40 years ago. And so I'm sort of questioning some of the premises of some of the talks that there has been more regulation these days than there was in the past, and that sort of over-regulation. The Competitive Enterprise Institute publishes a list of all the regulations every year, and when you go back and look at that list, proposed and final rules are below the level of the Reagan administration. So I'm just wondering, when we're talking about giving agencies new requirements of things like more regulatory analysis, implementing Senator Warner's proposal of one in, one out, formal rulemaking, and that sort of thing, how can we do all that if the agency's budgets and staffing levels are below the levels of the 1980s?
Jeff, I'm curious what source you have for that, because the annual report that the Wiedenbaum Center with Mercatus and now with me does suggest that staffing levels have been increasing.
Well, I think there probably has been an uptick in the last year or two, but when you look at, I mean, for regulations, I'm relying on the Competitive Enterprise 10,000 Commandments publication that they do every year, which is a very useful source. And if you just look at their tables in the back, you can compare proposed and final rules to going back to the 1970s. Staffing, I don't have a generalized study. I'd like to see one. I've just seen anecdotes.
I'll refer you. Go to www.regulatorystudies.gwu.edu, and it's there. It comes out every year, and so I use it because it's one of the few time series. Regulations, it's like the blind man and the elephant. We're all trying to figure out what it is, looking at different pieces, and it's one of those pieces is the staffing, but it has been. So
I guess what I was looking at were the studies by the Center for Progressive Regulation, which talks about the so-called hollowing out of government and compared specific agencies like the OSHA and CPSC, and found that OSHA had, many fewer inspectors per business than they did back in the 80s and that sort of thing. So it's anecdotal. I'll look at your website, though.
If I can, first of all, thanks for your comments on the report card. And for those of you who would like to see it, it's at mercatus.org/report card. We're extremely proud of this. I think you'll find it a fascinating resource. I just want to respond to one thing, and that's about the staffing of agencies. I think when agencies are putting out rules that perhaps cost $1 billion or more, The question for them isn't, do they need more overall resources, because their resources have gone up dramatically, particularly in the last 2 years. It's a question of how they allocate those resources. And I think before you impose a burden on the economy of $1 billion or more, you ought to invest more internally, shift your resources internally to knowing more about what are the impacts likely to be of those regulations.
Thank you. Mark Powell, Department of Agriculture. One comment on the pay-go potential unintended consequences, that the agencies would not offer up their dogs, but they would offer up programs with an important political champion on the Hill that they know will be reinserted. So in thinking about the institutional incentives, it can't be limited to the executive branch institutions in terms of how to constrain a pay-go regulatory budget. So if you have any response to that, I'd offer it, or I'd ask you for that. Also, a question. Prior to Cass Sunstein's appointment, there was some discussion about the potential for a catch-all regulatory decisional criteria. I don't know whether it would be done administratively or if it had to be done by statute, that would say, unless your statute prohibits consideration of cost, the default assumption would be that at a minimum you're permitted to consider cost. Is that on the table? And would it require statutory action, or could it be done administratively? Thank you.
Well, you've got two non-lawyers up here, but I would say, given the judicial history, you know, the case history on some of these regulations, that you'd have to do it statutorily. I mean, the Clean Air Act Section 109 doesn't say you cannot consider costs. It just says these are the factors you will consider, and it doesn't mention costs. And all the way up to the Supreme Court has ruled that that means EPA cannot consider costs.
Let me just address the PAYGO again. I'll just repeat. We have 226 volumes, 163,000 pages of rules. We've got to do something. Certainly PAYGO is one way to go after it. Another way, the possibility is a BRAC-style commission, where you would get interested people together to actually look at whole areas like the environment, like workplace safety, and decide which regulations we could actually eliminate. And the problem, of course, with all existing regulations, as was mentioned earlier, is there's a constituency for every single one of them. That's to keep it. There's not much of a constituency to get rid of them. So this is a real issue that we have to face. So let me bring a halt to it here, because I don't want to take 1 minute away from Professor Yandel's lunchtime speech, and we are going to move to lunch, and lunch is going to be right here.
But we have to leave.
So
We have to go out.
it's outside.
We have to go outside while they set up for lunch.
Right. That's right. Thank you, Susan. So everybody, they'll set up for lunch, and we'll be back here in a few minutes.